history as King George II of Britain and Ireland was born on the 10th of November 1683 in Herrenhausen Palace in the city of Hanover in northern Germany. At the time, Hanover was one of the more significant of the many states of varying sizes into which Germany was divided in early modern times. His father was Georg Ludwig, the ruler of Hanover. He would become the Prince Elector of Hanover in 1692, when his official title was elevated within the Holy Roman Empire, the loose political organization which covered Germany at the time. He would also become King George I of Britain and Ireland many years later in 1714. George's mother was Sophia Dorothea of Celle, daughter of the Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, George William. She had married slightly less than 12 months before her son's birth, and he was their first child. They would have only one other child, a daughter, named Sophia Dorothea after her mother, and born 4 years after George. George's early life was overshadowed by the difficulties in his parents' marriage. This was never a good one, and it took a more sinister turn when George was a child of 10 and 11. George Ludwig and Sophia Dorothea had been largely living apart for some time by then. The discovery that she was engaged in an affair with a Swedish count by the name of Philip Christoph von Königsmarck prompted a response which saw Sophia effectively placed under a form of house arrest in Celle in 1694 that lasted for over 30 years down to her death in 1726. George would never see his mother again after she was sent away, and his attachment to her memory was at least partly the cause of some of the difficulties in the relationship between him and his father in future years. After his mother's banishment, George was principally raised in the household of his paternal grandparents. He was tutored by numerous individuals, amongst whom Johann Hilmar Holstein was prominent as his languages tutor. George grew up to be able to speak German, French, English, and Italian, as well as having some Latin. His primary interest lay in history and military studies, and George was not shy of going into battle himself, as we will see. On the 2nd of September 1705, George married Caroline, a daughter of Johann Friedrich, the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach, in eastern Germany. This came after unsuccessful attempts to negotiate a marriage alliance with the Swedes through a union of George with Hedvig Sophia, a daughter of King Charles XI of Sweden. George and Caroline were virtually the same age, she being only 8 months older than George. Children soon followed. The eldest, who would be George's heir for much of the next half a century, was a boy named Frederick, born in January 1707. He was the first of 8 children. 5 girls named Anne, Amelia, Caroline, Mary and Louisa would follow between 1709 and 1724. The couple had 2 further sons, George William, born in 1717, and William August, born in 1721. Most lived long lives, though George William died in infancy and Caroline suffered at least 2 miscarriages and a stillbirth. The marriage was a strange one by modern standards, albeit not entirely unusual for the time. George and Caroline were reasonably close, but this did not stop him from keeping a string of mistresses throughout virtually the entirety of their 30-plus-year marriage. On the other hand, George consistently demonstrated his trust in his wife in the late 1720s and early 1730s when he appointed her as his representative when he left England on official duties. George was naturalized as an English citizen and made a member of one of the most important knightly orders there, the Order of the Garter, in the summer of 1706, as well as being given the title of Duke of Cambridge in the peerage there a few months later. This was all part of the expected succession of the Hanoverians to the British throne in years to come. He was also involved in the War of the Spanish Succession with the British. The conflict had broken out in 1701 over a dispute as to who should succeed to the Spanish throne after the direct line of the Spanish Habsburgs died out, with both France and Austria putting forth a candidate. The disagreement soon spawned a Europe-wide war. The Prince-Electorate of Hanover sided with Austria, as the Austrian Habsburgs were virtually the hereditary heads of the Holy Roman Empire by then, yet the Hanoverians tried to limit their involvement as much as possible in practice. The same was not true of George. An enthusiastic military campaigner, he fought on the British and Austrian side at the very important Battle of Oudenarde in the Spanish Netherlands, west of Brussels, on the 11th of July 1708, against the French. Here he showed considerable bravery, having a horse shot out from underneath him during the fighting, where others of his status might simply have watched from the rear. Soon George's fate would lie more in England than in Germany. For many years it had been clear that a succession issue was brewing in England. It was this which had resulted in George being made Duke of Cambridge in 1706. Queen Anne was the last direct member of the House of Stuart who could plausibly sit on the throne in Britain, her half-brother being a Roman Catholic in exile and disbarred from succeeding owing to his religion. Consequently, George's father was the likeliest successor by right of George's grandmother being the granddaughter of King James I, who had ruled England between 1603 and 1625. With Anne having suffered an appalling series of stillbirths and failed pregnancies, and the 5 live-born children she gave birth to having generally died before the age of 2, she had no children of her own left to succeed her after 1700. Therefore, when she died on the 1st of August 1714, it was evident that George's father would succeed as King George I of Britain and Ireland. One day, George would succeed him as George II if he lived that long. With that in mind, the Hanoverians prepared to head for England. It was a peculiar scenario. The new king only had a very bare grasp of English. The first years of George's time in England were difficult ones in some respects. His relationship with his father had been fraught for some time, something which would become a tradition between king and heir within the House of Hanover. It only worsened in the years from 1714 onwards in his position as Prince of Wales, the formal title he held as heir to the British throne. A major quarrel broke out between father and son in 1717. This had been brewing for some time, and was in part owing to the relative popularity of George in contrast to his father, who was deemed aloof by his new subjects, preferring a slimmed-down court and his own company to a more colourful court. The incident which sparked a full rift was the christening of George's ill-fated son, George William, who would die after just 3 months. The king insisted on the Duke of Newcastle being appointed as the child's godfather, something to which George objected. An argument ensued during the ceremony, in the course of which Newcastle mistakenly thought George was challenging him to a duel. In the furore which followed, the king kicked George and his family out of St. James's Palace and informed many at court that they would have to choose between their loyalties to him or the Prince of Wales. It was an overreaction on George's father's part. Still, it took 2.5 years before a reconciliation of a kind was reached in April 1720, and even then, the relationship between the prince and the king remained strained for the remainder of George I's life. George I died on the 11th of June 1727 while travelling from the Low Countries to northern Germany during one of his frequent visits to Hanover. A sign that he had never fully acclimatized to being ruler of Britain was seen in the fact that he was buried in Hanover 3.5 weeks later, not in England. A strange development which quickly followed concerned the late king's will. It was presented at a council meeting shortly after news of his death arrived at London. There, George II duly pocketed it, and it was never seen again. Other copies had been left on the continent, but could not be easily located at the time. Historians have since determined that it probably contained a clause whereby once Prince Frederick, George's eldest son and the new Prince of Wales, died, the Hanoverian territories would be divided, with one heir staying as King of Britain and Ireland, and the Prince-Electorate of Hanover passing to another branch of the family. George clearly did not want his father pulling such strings from beyond the grave. Whether he destroyed the will or it was lost in some other fashion remains unclear. The new king and his queen were crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 11th of October 1727 in a rather modestly budgeted and quickly organized affair. It was notably carried out to the sound of music composed by George Frederick Handel. These included Zadok the Priest, a stirring arrangement which has been performed prior to the anointing of every British monarch since 1727. George had ascended the throne at a critical juncture in British political and colonial history. As recently as the 16th century, England had been considered one of Europe's second-tier powers, dwarfed by the Habsburgs of Spain and Austria, and standing firmly in the shadow of the Dutch Republic in terms of its trading and commercial power. That had changed by the early 18th century, as the English began colonizing much of the eastern seaboard of North America from 1607 onwards, occupying many small islands in the West Indies, which became valuable sugar colonies, and establishing a significant presence in Asia under the rubric of the English East India Company. It had also eclipsed the Dutch as the preeminent naval and trading power of Northern Europe through 3 wars with them in quick succession between 1652 and 1674. By the dawn of the 18th century, it was entering into a period of prolonged rivalry with France to become the foremost power in Europe, one that saw the two states at war with each other so frequently between 1689 and 1815 that many historians now speak of a second 100 Years' War between England and France during this era, the first having occurred back between 1337 and 1453. George's reign was critical in that tussle, While France had very much been the more powerful state when this commenced in the late 17th century, his 33-year reign would see the pendulum swing in Britain's favour. This was an age of extensive letter writing and diary keeping, much more so than previous centuries, and we have a good idea of how George conducted his daily routines as king, both from his own pen and those who spent time around him. From these, we learn that he was a monarch who took an active interest in political affairs. At the same time, he could hardly be described as a workaholic or someone who was concerned with the minutiae of administration. He spent much of his time hunting and engaged in what were considered traditional royal and aristocratic pursuits. The hours of the day that he did meet senior figures within the government, notably Robert Walpole, considered the first Prime Minister of Britain and the longest-serving, saw him take a keen interest in foreign affairs. This was hardly out of the ordinary. Britain was at war for over half of the 33 years that George was on the throne. The new king didn't display the same regard for domestic affairs, and he tended to leave these to Walpole and others. As we will see, he has often been smeared as being a figure who was dominated by the senior politicians of the age. Clearly, there were reasons for such an approach. The court formalities of the 18th century, with their endless morning and evening rituals, banquets and court engagements, left little time for sitting at a desk, worrying over the specifics of economic or judicial policy. Luckily, we also have some colourful accounts of George's life as king and his personality. Surely, the most salacious are those of John Harvey, a secretary to the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. His memoirs were considered too revelatory of royal life to be published in the 18th century. In them, he revealed how the king kept a string of mistresses, most notably the Countess of Suffolk, Henrietta Howard, and the Countess of Deloraine, Mary Scott, but that there was a bizarre level of formality when he engaged with them, almost as though he was welcoming foreign dignitaries to his court. George was not exactly kind when it came to ending these trysts. He intended to dismiss the Countess of Suffolk from court at one juncture on the basis of her being old and increasingly deaf, only for the Queen, George's wife, to have to intervene on her behalf. Deloraine was described as constantly smelling of Spanish wine. Elsewhere, we see a king with a foul mouth, one who surrounded himself with individuals with a childish sense of humour. It was considered comical to pull the seat out from under someone as they were about to sit down, sending them cascading to the floor. A less pleasant aspect to all of this, though, was George's temper, which was considerable. He was regularly seen throwing off his wig and kicking it about the royal apartments, while swearing intensely, or sulking and refusing to engage with people who had committed minor infractions. This was the man who became king in 1727. By the 18th century, the monarchs of Britain were no longer as powerful as most other European monarchs. Through a series of constitutional changes and wars stretching back to the Magna Carta of 1215 and forward to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Britain had become a constitutional monarchy. Kings and queens still had considerable power in the 18th century, but Parliament was the preeminent authority in the country and managed political affairs on a day-to-day basis. Where George did have a role to play was in deciding on senior ministerial positions and trying to balance the often competing interests of the two major political parties, the conservative Tories and the more liberal Whigs. Robert Walpole, who is generally deemed to have been Britain's first Prime Minister, was already in office when George became king, and he did not change that arrangement, with Walpole remaining in post until 1742. Charles Viscount Townshend, a brother-in-law of Walpole's, was a close ally as leader of the House of Lords, though he stepped down in 1730. As both men were long-standing leaders of the Whigs, George's reign, at least in the first half of it, has been viewed as being dominated by the more liberal-leaning party. This had a particular impact on religious affairs during George's reign, as one of the cornerstones of Whig liberalism was a tolerance for most strands of Protestantism, whereas the Tories at this time argued for a narrower adherence to the Anglicanism of the Church of England. The years of Walpole's ministry during George's reign were relatively peaceful ones until late on in it. A short war was fought with Spain between 1727 and 1729. This was largely ignited by the Spanish in the final months of George I's reign, as they initiated a siege of the Rock of Gibraltar, a possession in the southern tip of Spain which had been lost to the British at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession a decade and a half earlier. After limited clashes and naval action in the Caribbean, the war petered out in 1729 without achieving much. Thereafter, Walpole engineered an ever closer relationship with Austria on the international front, something which George was inclined towards as one of the electors of the Holy Roman Empire. Despite the King and Queen's tendency towards intervention, Walpole also kept Britain out of the short-lived War of the Polish Succession in the mid-1730s. At home, this decade saw numerous land tax acts in support of the Crown passed through Parliament, something which impacted on George's household and court. Beyond this, there was little marquee legislation passed during this era. Instead, a perusal of the statutes of the Parliament of Great Britain highlights the emergence of a modern Parliament, one which was concerned with rather routine issues of government. Everything from the regulation of the sale of hats to the cutting of hedges on the sides of the king's highways was legislated for. A growing problem in these years was one that George had experienced before. However, previously, he had been on the other side of it. This concerned his relationship with his own heir, his eldest son Frederick. Frederick had been left in Germany at the time of the Hanoverian succession and spent nearly 14 years being raised here, while his father and mother were in England. When the Prince of Wales arrived to England to take up his position as heir in 1727, he was consequently something of a stranger to George. The relationship between king and heir was difficult following Frederick's arrival in London, and it did not improve the longer they spent in the same country. They boiled over nearly a decade into the reign after Frederick married Augusta of the House of Saxe-Gotha, and almost immediately appealed to Parliament without consulting his father to increase his allowance, now that he was mired in the business of producing his own heir. George's famous temper exploded at this perceived act of betrayal, and, in an almost carbon copy of the dispute between him and his own father back in 1717, he threw Frederick and his new wife out of St. James's Palace. The rift would not be healed for many years, and there were constant rumours that the king intended to bypass Frederick in favour of his other surviving son, William, Duke of Cumberland, with whom he had a much better relationship. The difficulties of this father-son relationship for George were added to when Queen Caroline died in November 1737, when a hernia ruptured her bowel. Her and George's marriage had been a strange one. His constant infidelity didn't speak of a close attachment, yet he was genuinely distraught at her passing, and somewhat touchingly insisted he would not remarry when she was on her deathbed. Conflicts of another kind were brewing on the continent. In 1739, Britain ended up at war with Spain again. It became known as the War of Jenkins' Ear, as the British government launched it based on an incident back in 1731 when a British seaman, Robert Jenkins, had his ship boarded and his ear cut off by Spanish mariners. In reality, the incident was simply dredged up as a relatively good excuse for going to war with Spain in order to improve Britain's position in the Caribbean. The War of Jenkins' Ear soon morphed into a wider European conflict, one which would run through nearly a decade in the middle of George's reign. This was the War of the Austrian Succession. This war came about owing to the issue of female succession in the lands of the Austrian Habsburgs, which included most of modern-day Austria, Hungary, Czechia, Slovenia, and Croatia, as well as additional lands in Italy and the Austrian Netherlands. Back in 1713, Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor and Archduke of Austria, had overseen the passage of a pragmatic sanction to ensure that his niece, Maria Josepha, could potentially succeed him if he died childless, as his marriage had not yet resulted in children. This was needed to overturn the Salic law, a very old medieval law which prevented women from succeeding to the throne in several European countries. Just a few years later, Charles's marriage did produce children, but this was a daughter by the name of Maria Theresa. Thus, the pragmatic sanction was still needed when Charles died in 1740 to allow Maria Theresa to succeed. War followed because a number of the European powers, foremost amongst which were Prussia, Bavaria, and Saxony, all saw the possibility of making gains in Germany by objecting to Maria Theresa's succession as Holy Roman Empress. So began the War of the Austrian Succession in December 1740. Britain did not have a clear interest in the war when what was primarily a Central European affair broke out. Instead, its entry into it was predicated on a number of other factors. First and foremost, France quickly entered the war on the side of Prussia, and it was clear that the French intended to use the conflict as an opportunity to seize some of the Austrian Netherlands in what is now Belgium. Given the constant rivalry between the French and British at the time, there was no doubt that the British would quickly ally with Austria to block French ambitions. Secondly, George II did have a personal interest in the German dimension of the conflict as Prince Elector of Hanover. Therefore, Britain was partially dragged into the War of the Austrian Succession on account of George's Hanoverian ties. The war would last for 8 years. Much of the fighting played out in Central Europe and the Low Countries. British contributions were primarily seen in the latter region, and the Rhineland as well as at sea, where the British Royal Navy faced both French and Spanish flotillas in a wide theatre of naval warfare in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. This video is sponsored by Odoo, a platform that offers a suite of apps for all your business needs. Join 12 million other Odoo users worldwide who have discovered how having all your business needs met in one place increases efficiency and makes managing your business a breeze. Odoo saves your employees time and you money. It is fully customizable and is an amazing addition to any business. The CRM app in Odoo helps you organize your sales activities, track leads, close opportunities, and get accurate forecasts. You can visually organize opportunities with different views, such as the list view, calendar view, and with the Kanban view, each opportunity is displayed as a card that you can easily drag across each stage. Every card has its essential information, and you can quickly add activities to ensure no follow-up is missed. Incoming emails and internal exchanges are handled in one place, ensuring easy access to the discussion history at all times. Managing an opportunity can easily be done through Odoo's CRM application, adding won or lost when the status is known to keep your database up to date. Plus, by pulling a monthly expected revenue report, sales managers can see which team members are reaching their goals and who may need additional assistance to close valuable deals. In addition, the sales reporting function presents your key information clearly on a customizable dashboard. Be one of the ever-increasing numbers of people who grow their business with Odoo. Just click the link in the description and boost your sales with Odoo's CRM. The first app is completely free for life with unlimited hosting and support. George took what by the 18th century was a very unusual decision for a British monarch to campaign militarily in person during the war. In the summer of 1743, at nearly 60 years of age, he headed for the continent to take personal command of the British Army there, one which was seeking to make a breakthrough in association with the Austrians against the French in the Rhineland. Hence followed the Battle of Dettingen near Mainz on the 27th of June 1743. Here, a joint British and Austrian force of over 30,000 faced a substantially numerically inferior French army of not much more than 20,000 men. The fighting only lasted for a few hours and ended when the French, recognizing that their strategic situation was not ideal, retreated across the River Main. The majority of the casualties that they suffered occurred because one of the bridges that they used to traverse the river collapsed. Dettingen had little strategic bearing on the wider course of the war, yet George earned a lot of respect back home for campaigning in person. It was the last time that a reigning British monarch would campaign militarily in this way. By the time the Battle of Dettingen was fought, the War of the Austrian Succession had descended into something of a stalemate. Facing the combined forces of Austria and Britain, the French could not make a major breakthrough in the Netherlands or the Rhineland, and the conflict in Central Europe had become a to and fro affair. Several more years of conflict followed before both sides reached the realization that their treasuries could not tolerate the financial cost of such pointless warfare. The British and French were already engaging in peace talks by 1746. However, it took until October 1748 before the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was agreed to by all parties. The delay was owing to Austrian unwillingness to meet the Prussian demand that it cede the province of Silesia around the modern-day junction of Germany, Poland, and Czechia to Prussia. This was a very valuable province, one with extensive coal and mineral mines, and the Austrians were reluctant to relinquish it. Eventually, the British convinced them that this was the only way to end the war and ensure European-wide recognition of Maria Theresa's position as Archduchess of Austria and Holy Roman Empress. The Austrians relented, but the implications were significant, effectively sundering the long-standing Anglo-Austrian alliance that had existed in one form or another since the late 1680s. When another European war broke out, the Austrians and British would be on different sides. The War of the Austrian Succession might have started as a Central European issue. Nevertheless, it had colonial implications, especially the clash within it between the British and Spanish. A huge part of this was connected to the growing dominance of the slave trade by the British. Curiously, the age of the Enlightenment in Europe, when the abolitionist movement emerged, was also the era when the transatlantic slave trade was at its very worst. Britain was central to it, and ports like Liverpool and Bristol benefited enormously from the trade in human beings between 1700 and 1800. There is no avoiding George's role in this. He was the governor of the South Sea Company between 1727 and 1760, a monopoly that controlled much of Britain's slave trade, as his father had been before him, and as George III would be until the slave trade was abolished by the British Parliament in 1807. During the period he was governor, tens of thousands of slaves were trafficked across the Atlantic by the South Sea Company. George also expressed views which indicated his support for the slave trade, and he himself owned slaves on plantations in the West Indies that the Crown had a stake in. In the midst of the War of the Austrian Succession, the House of Hanover faced the gravest threat to it in Britain from the Jacobite cause that had yet been seen. The Jacobites were the supporters of the line of King James II, Jacobus being the Latin for James. That monarch had been deposed in England back in 1688 on the grounds of being a Roman Catholic. He and his descendants from his second marriage to Mary of Modena had subsequently lived in exile in France. His son had attempted an uprising in Scotland in 1715, shortly after the ascent of the House of Hanover, to little avail. Much more serious was the rising which Charles Edward Stuart, the grandson of King James II, attempted in 1745 in Scotland. He arrived there after ensuring the support of numerous senior Scottish aristocrats, including the Dukes of Perth and Athol. After commencing the revolt in August, they quickly seized control of Edinburgh and then proceeded southwards. The Jacobite forces reached as far as Derby in England. They soon retreated back to Scotland, for the Jacobite support which Charles had assured his Scottish followers would materialize in northern England never came. The rising was snuffed out when an English force under George's younger son, William, Duke of Cumberland, defeated the Scots at the Battle of Culloden on the 16th of April 1746. Charles Edward Stuart fled back to the continent. He would live for over 40 years after this, only dying in Rome in 1788. He never gave up on his hopes of leading a fresh expedition to Britain, though, in reality, the Jacobite cause never threatened the House of Hanover again after the Jacobite Rising of 1745. The years following the end of the War of the Austrian Succession were dominated by a succession crisis in England. While George had partially reconciled with Frederick in the course of the mid-1740s, this was merely a public formality, and as late as 1748, he was heard to proclaim his disdain for his heir. Nevertheless, Frederick would not succeed him. On the 31st of March 1751, he died suddenly while playing cricket on the lawns of Leicester House in London after being hit by a ball. It used to be believed that the blow had resulted in a lung abscess. Recent studies have conversely conjectured that his death was the product of a pulmonary embolism, the blockage of an artery leading into the lungs. Frederick's untimely passing cast open the issue of the succession, with some speculating that this now made the likelihood of the Duke of Cumberland succeeding George as his younger son a possibility once again. The king, though, was happy to allow Frederick's eldest son from his marriage, Prince George, a 12-year-old at the time of his father's death in 1751, to become his heir in line with the natural order of succession. George, it should be remembered, ruled territories beyond Britain. He showed virtually zero interest in Ireland and never visited the country. Regardless, or perhaps because of this, he was esteemed there to a greater degree than many other British monarchs. This was because the country had done relatively well economically during his reign, as the port cities and towns benefited from extensive Atlantic trade as a stopping-off point in voyages between Britain and the 13 colonies in North America, while Dublin had emerged as one of Europe's great capitals. A sign of this was seen when a very large equestrian statue of George was raised on the Grand Parade in the city of Cork, following his death at the corporation's own expense. On the continent, George did not have anywhere near the affinity for Hanover that his father had before him. George I had spent large parts of his reign as King of Great Britain and Ireland in Germany, visiting Hanover whenever business in England allowed. George II was a much less frequent visitor to his homeland, though he did occasionally return there, the last such visit being in 1755. Hanover was always a factor in his management of Britain's foreign policy as well, much to the annoyance of many senior politicians at Whitehall in the 1730s, 1740s, and 1750s. The politics of the middle and later stages of George's reign were less consistent than the first decade and a half of it, when Walpole had provided stability. Henry Pelham served as Prime Minister for over a decade, from 1743 to 1754. In spite of this, the administration was much more fragmented, with John Carteret, 2nd Baron Carteret, being the real power in Parliament early on, and others, such as Lord Bath, holding considerable authority in the years thereafter. A perennially rising figure at this time was William Pitt the Elder, who successively acquired positions as Paymaster of the Forces and eventually became leader of the House of Commons towards the end of George's reign. He would have risen to a senior post in British politics earlier had it not been for George disliking him intensely, an animosity which first emerged in 1735 and 1736, when Pitt established himself as a critic of the government in Parliament, and especially of its failure to intervene in the War of the Polish Succession. That George could not fully block Pitt's promotion in the 1740s and 1750s is a sign of how effective the constitutional monarchy in Britain was by the mid-18th century in terms of compartmentalizing the respective powers of the Crown and Parliament. Pelham's death in 1754 occurred at an inopportune time as Britain was about to once more descend into another long war. The first stirrings of this occurred in North America, where Britain ruled the 13 colonies stretching between New Hampshire and Georgia along the east coast of the modern-day United States. France controlled New France, a territory which included the eastern provinces of modern-day Canada, but also nominally a stretch of land running from the Great Lakes south along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to Louisiana. The French presence in much of the latter region was very limited, with little more than a few forts and trading stations in places like Ohio. The goal of these was clearly to hem the 13 colonies in and prevent future British expansion in North America inland from places like New England and Pennsylvania. Conflict broke out in 1754 after repeated clashes along the frontier in Canada, the Great Lakes, and the Ohio River. Both sides would involve their Native American allies in a clash which was memorably captured in James Fenimore Cooper's novel, The Last of the Mohicans. It was, ultimately, a very poor decision by the French to go to war here. The colonial community in Quebec and other parts of eastern Canada was about 60,000 strong at the time. The population of the 13 colonies was at least 1.5 million. These resources would soon come to bear, and by the late 1750s, the British and their Iroquois allies had gained the upper hand, with Quebec falling to the British in 1759 and Montreal in 1760. The French and Indian Wars in North America soon morphed into a much wider conflict in 1756. The 7 Years' War, as it would become known, came about owing to diplomatic ruptures on the continent, with Austria determined to go to war with Prussia in an effort to recover the province of Silesia that it had lost back in 1748 at the end of the War of the Austrian Succession. The difference in this new instance was that Britain was now allied with Prussia and Austria with France. As ever, the fact that George was the Prince-Elector of Hanover, as well as King of Great Britain and Ireland, complicated British foreign policy, though in this case British entry into the war was made easier by the fact that a limited colonial war with France in North America was already underway. The 7 Years' War that now ensued has been termed the first global conflict, as the fighting touched virtually every continent. The main theatres were in Europe and North America, yet there was also fighting in the Caribbean, South America, Western Africa, and India. George's role in managing parts of the war effort in London were made difficult by both his own old age and flagging health, and also his continuing resistance to the rise of William Pitt, whose ascendancy was being promoted amongst the Whigs when no statesman of ability emerged to replace Pelham after 1754. A compromise was subsequently worked out, whereby Pitt became leader of the House of Commons, and the Duke of Newcastle, Thomas Pelham, brother of Henry and a protégé of Walpole's years earlier, was made Prime Minister in 1757. Newcastle had already filled the role between 1754 and 1756, though in something of a more interim capacity than he now achieved. He was the last Prime Minister of George's reign, and served until 1762. Though things were going well in North America and at sea, the war effort proceeded poorly on the continent at first. On the 26th of July 1757, George's sole surviving son, the Duke of Cumberland, was defeated by a French force invading Hanover at the Battle of Hastenbeck. It ruined his previously successful military career and led to the Convention of Klosterzeven, whereby Hanover agreed to exit the war separately from Britain in order to avoid being occupied by the French. Under pressure from King Frederick II of Prussia and from Pitt in Parliament, George disavowed the agreement in 1758. War was not the only consideration of the 1750s for the king. Two events in the twilight of George's life were completely out of character. George II cannot be said to have been a cultured or cultivated man. He had a juvenile sense of humor and seemed to primarily be interested in cards and hunting. He almost never read and displayed a kind of fascination with the fact that his wife wished to have scholars and artists at the court, as though he couldn't wrap his head around why she would bother. It is somewhat surprising, then, to learn that in the 1750s he presided over the creation of two very significant cultural institutions. For decades there had been plans in England to create an institution which would house archives of documents of historical significance and objects, one that might be called a museum, after the word mousion, the Greek term for the Library of Alexandria in ancient times, named after the muses of Greek religion and mythology. When Sir Hans Sloane, a doctor and scientist from Ulster in the north of Ireland, died in 1753, he had assembled a huge collection to this end, one which he bequeathed to George with directives to use it to establish a museum. While he might have had little interest in it on a personal level, George should be credited for quickly ordering the passage of an Act of Parliament which created the British Museum. Over a quarter of a millennium later, it remains one of the greatest museums in the world. Part of the basis of the museum was the private papers which Sloane had collected over the decades. These, along with the enormous range of papers collected by the 17th century antiquarian Sir Robert Cotton, and the archives of the first Earl of Oxford, Robert Harley, were the foundational collections of the museum. Today, they are located separately and form the bedrock of the manuscript archives of the British Library. A fourth collection was soon added to the Sloane, Cottonian and Harleian manuscripts, and this again involved George II. In 1757, 4 years after the museum was established, he donated the Old Royal Library to it, a set of some 2,000 rare manuscripts and books collected by various monarchs of England and Britain since the late medieval era. Some of these are highly valuable ancient texts, illuminated manuscripts, and early printed books. A highlight is the Codex Alexandrinus, one of the 4 great unsealed codices, the 4 earliest surviving manuscripts in ancient Greek, dating to the 4th and 5th centuries AD. They still form the basis of the royal manuscripts at the British Library, a collection that George's successors would add to. In many ways, George's actions in establishing the British Museum in 1753 and the Royal Manuscripts Collection in 1757 was a product of his sheer disinterest in reading. Had he been more interested, he might have kept the Royal Collection to himself and added Sloane's archive to it, but instead, he gifted them to the nation, and in doing so laid the basis for 2 of Britain's great cultural institutions, the British Museum and the British Library. Another development towards the end of George's reign would have an even greater long-term impact than the foundation of the British Museum. It happened on the other side of the world, in India. English involvement in the subcontinent had begun a century and a half earlier, when the English East India Company was founded in 1600 as one of the main joint stock companies being set up in London at the time to further English colonial activity and trade abroad. with the Anglo-Portuguese alliance of 1662, through which Catherine of Braganza married King Charles II, England received Bombay, modern-day Mumbai, as part of the marriage alliance. The English East India Company continued to expand their activities thereafter, acquiring footholds in Madras and Kolkata in the first half of the 18th century. There were impediments to further expansion, though. Firstly, the French were colonial rivals here and had established their own bases around Pondicherry in the 1720s and 1730s. Secondly, the Indian states were much more technologically and organizationally advanced than, for instance, the native states that the Spanish had faced in Central and South America in the 16th century, and conquering them would be much more difficult. Still, they were also very divided, with the Mughal Empire controlling Delhi and much of the north, the Maratha Empire as the largest force in central India, numerous smaller states, such as Hyderabad and the Kingdom of Mysore, dominating the southern half of the Deccan Plateau in the south of the subcontinent, and a large patchwork of kingdoms ruled by Nawabs in the east, of which Bengal was the most substantial. If the English East India Company handled things well, what it could do was play these competing powers off against each other and slowly increase its own power. Into this mix in the mid-1740s arrived Robert Clive, a young man from Shropshire who had come to India to take up a position as a clerk with the East India Company. He gradually worked his way up to a military station and then a senior command position. Ironically, it was the wars back in Europe which accelerated English expansion in India over the next several years, as French efforts to undermine the East India Company's position forced the company to employ ever greater resources. There were clashes here between the British and French and their respective native allies in the 1740s and early 1750s, but it was really with the full outbreak of the 7 Years' War in 1756 that the fighting intensified. This culminated in the Battle of Plassey on the 23rd of June 1757, about 150 kilometers north of Kolkata. The battle was far from conclusive in terms of losses. However, it established the strategic and technological superiority of the English over the Indians, as Clive, with approximately 750 men and 2,000 native allies, managed to force a Bengali army of some 50,000 men to retreat after an intense cannon barrage. In the aftermath, Clive consolidated the company's hold over the Bengal region, vastly expanding English influence in India in the process. When news of the victory at Plassey arrived to England, which would have taken a considerable amount of time in an age when sea travel around southern Africa was still the swiftest means of delivering such news, it would have been greeted with great enthusiasm amongst the shareholders of the English East India Company in London. We don't know much of what George II thought about it, something which might have been revealed had more of the king's private papers survived. Most of them were destroyed after his lifetime, owing to poor rules concerning the preservation of state papers at the time. What we do know is that Plassey was just the beginning of a period of rapid English expansion in India. In the years that followed, the company moved further inland to consolidate its control of the region between Kolkata and Allahabad, while effectively removing the French from the scene and replacing them as the preeminent power along the Coromandel coast in the southeast of the subcontinent. Wars followed intermittently with the Marathas, the foremost power opposing company expansion. These would culminate in the capture of Delhi in 1803, although by then much of the rest of India was already under English control. The British Raj would only come into existence in 1858, after company rule had resulted in a vast mutiny across India the previous year, and the government had to take more direct control over the administration of the region. But the roots of British rule here were sown in the final years of the reign of George II. The final years of George's reign were inevitably taken up with the war with France. After an initial series of reverses and stalemates, things improved from 1758 onwards. Successful naval raids were launched on the French coast. These were not strategically significant in and of themselves, but they forced the French to allocate resources to defending various parts of northern and western France that could have been used to greater effect elsewhere. Further raids in Western Africa captured a number of French forts around modern-day Senegal. The most important development by some distance was the capture in April 1759 of the island of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. This French sugar colony might have been small in geographical terms. However, it was so economically valuable that when the French were forced to decide between ceding it or Canada during the peace talks at the end of the war, they chose to keep Guadeloupe and relinquished Canada to the British. Were it not for this small island and the capture of it in 1759, the history of North America might have been very different. At home, there was the perennial managing of political squabbles between William Pitt and Newcastle. The king also showed a concern for the political education of his grandson, the future King George III. There were the inevitable discussions about his marriage. The prince was enamored with Sarah Lennox, a sister of the Duke of Richmond, but he was quietly dissuaded from a relationship with her on the basis that he needed to marry someone from one of Europe's great royal or aristocratic houses for diplomatic reasons. Eventually, he would marry Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a union which would become one of the happier ones in British royal history, though this did not occur until after George II himself had passed. By the late 1750s, George was in increasingly poor health. He was, after all, into his mid-70s, and this was quite an old age in the 18th century. It was taking its toll. The king was largely deaf and had lost the sight in one of his eyes. On the other hand, he was not suffering from any clear illness that indicated he would soon die. Instead, the end, when it came, was sudden. On the morning of the 25th of October 1760, he arose to drink his morning hot chocolate in his chambers at Kensington Palace, and then retired to his close stool. On the way back to his writing desk, a loud crash was heard, and when his valets reached the source of the noise, he was found collapsed on the floor. They managed to help him into his bed, where he died not long after from what is understood to have been an aortic dissection, where blood begins to breach the walls of the aorta. He was 76 years of age, though, owing to the divergences between the new-style Gregorian calendar in Hanover, where George was born in 1683, and the continuing adherence to the old-style Julian calendar in Britain until 1752, George was viewed as having recently turned 77 by some in England at the time. His funeral was held at Westminster Abbey on the 11th of November, and he was buried under the central aisle of Lady Chapel. In spite of his unfaithfulness to her, he left instructions for his marble coffin to be placed directly next to Queen Caroline's, with the sides of each removed, so that their ashes could intermingle in death. He was the last monarch to be interred at Westminster Abbey, with monarchs from George III onwards buried at Windsor Castle. The tempo for the next quarter of a century of British growth had been set in George's reign. The English East India Company continued to expand at remarkable speed in one of the most peculiar stories of corporate success in human history. By the late 18th century, the English East India Company had conquered large stretches of the Indian subcontinent, paving the way for the creation of the British Raj in the 19th century. The 7 Years' War came to an end in 1763. Under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, the French ceded what is now eastern Canada to Britain, with huge implications for the political, cultural, and linguistic history of North America. Elsewhere, however, some problems had been bequeathed to his grandson George III, who would reign as king for 60 years, albeit for much of which he was incapacitated owing to serious illness. In particular, the Crown had failed to prepare in any fashion for how it might reward the colonial community of the 13 colonies for their service in fighting the French and their native allies from 1754 onwards. Within 15 years of George's death, they would be at war with the Crown government, and a year later they issued a Declaration of Independence, through which they proclaimed the birth of a United States of America. The 13 colonies were lost under George III's watch, but things like this don't happen in a historical vacuum. Much of the roots of what went wrong in the colonies lie in the earlier reign of his grandfather. For a very long time, George II was viewed poorly by historians and the British public at large. Much of this was based on the belated publication of the memoirs of Walpole's secretary, John Harvey, in 1848. These painted the monarch in a less than flattering light, the very reason why they did not appear in print for nearly 90 years after George's passing. Here, a picture of a boorish and unimaginative monarch who was prone to violent tempers and whose swearing was frequent was presented, compounded by his lack of interest in high culture and his maintenance of many mistresses at court. However, in recent decades, his reputation has been somewhat rehabilitated. Emphasis has been placed on his balancing of political factions during his extended reign, and the manner in which the conflicts of the period left Britain in a much better position, within the Second 100 Years' War being fought with France, although it would be a few years after George's death that the Treaty of Paris of 1763 confirmed this. His reign was also a formative one in the history of the British Raj, with the 1750s setting off a chain of events which have left an indelible mark on a subcontinent that is home to 1 out of every 6 human beings today. George was a flawed monarch and an even more flawed person, but he was not one of England or Britain's worst. What do you think of King George II? Was he one of England's more underappreciated monarchs, whose personal failings have overshadowed a period of sound kingship as Britain began to emerge as a global power? Please